7. The Lacanian real. One is led to the idea of a traumatic event, an event that cannot be an object of positivist historical study because it never takes place in the way historical situations do, but rather defines the place in which these situations come to inscribe themselves, a rupture that constitutes the never-present origins of a race, for example. Why never present? Because it is a structural impossibility to be present at one's own origin, except in the experience of the uncanny. This is as good a definition of the uncanny as one will find, the experience of encountering one's own origins. Freud theorized that such an encounter was felt by the ego as a threat that initiated a preparedness for action or flight. The flight that ensues need not, however, be considered as merely reactive. The act for which the encounter prepares us can also be one of invention. 1 Introductory remarks. The first move of Lacan's treatment of the paradoxical real in Tush and Automaton 2 is to defend psychoanalysis against the charge of subjective idealism. 3 Psychoanalysis, he notes, is often enough reproached for reducing experience to illusion or for promoting some such aphorism as life is a dream but nothing could be further from the truth. As he insists, no praxis is more orientated towards that which, at the heart of experience, is the kernel of the real than psychoanalysis for encountering the charge of subjective idealism. However, Lacan by no means resorts to the opposing doctrine of naive realism. To the contrary, he threatens this stance too. 213 because the kernel of the real turns out to be a thoroughly paradoxical notion. Accordingly, posing the question, where do we meet this real, he answers, in an essential encounter with what eludes us. 5 Lacan introduces a term borrowed from Aristotle, the tush, to name this encounter, which may be described alternatively as the traumatic cause of the repetition compulsion or simply as the real. The tush is here contrasted with the automaton, which designates the fabric of phenomenal reality that we humans tend to weave around the real. The real as trauma, a reading of Tush and Automaton. The automaton Lacan describes the automaton as the return, the coming back, the insistence of the signs, by which we see ourselves governed by the pleasure principle. 6 Again, he calls it the subjectifying homeostasis that orientates the whole functioning defined by the pleasure principle. 7 These definitions presuppose his thoroughgoing revision of the relationship that Freud envisaged between the pleasure and reality. Principles in psychical functioning, a clear, concise account of which appears in his earlier ethics seminar. 8 Here, Lacan finds that Freud's conception of the real is intrinsically troubled. On the one hand, it stems from an naive realism that finds the guarantee of phenomenal reality in the repetition of external objects we found by reality testing. Early in his theoretical endeavor, Lacan expresses surprise that so perspicacious a thinker as Freud should misrecognize the working of the very unconscious he so powerfully uncovered. In his words, the theoretical difficulties encountered by Freud seem to me in fact to derive from the mirage of objectification, inherited from classical psychology, constituted by the idea of the perception/consciousness system, in which Freud seems suddenly to fail to recognize the existence of everything that the ego neglects, scotomizes, misconstrues in the sensations that make it react to reality, everything that it ignores, exhausts, and binds in the significations that it receives from language, a surprising mechanisance on the part of the man who succeeded by the power of his dialectic in forcing back the limits of the unconscious. 9 On the other hand, Freud does insist that pleasure plays an originally determining role in the constitution of phenomenal reality, and he holds 214 the pleasure principle responsible for our tendency to construct it as a comfortable, economic fabrication, rather than submit to a brutally honest account of actual experience. This vacillation, as already noted in Chapter 5, is the consequence of necessary trouble in the original relation of repetition between what happens and its presentation to consciousness. However, if the pleasure principle does not relinquish control over the perceptual process, Freud believed he had saved reality testing from desire because it belongs to the secondary process, which is supposedly sharply divided from the primary process. Once this division becomes untenable, as Lacan has argued, then one has to accept that desire bears upon word presentations as much as on thing presentations, and therefore on one's judgment concerning the reality status of any intentional object. In other words, the reality testing of the secondary process never was a safeguard against the deceptions of the primary process, not even for Freud. 10 Thus, if the primary process tends toward an identity of perception, I believe that what I imagine is identical to what is real. Lacan extends the argument to insist that the secondary process tends toward an identity of thought. I believe that what I think is identical to what is real. How so? If reality testing gradually leads to anastomosis, the cross-connection of ideas and perceptions that allows for something like Husserl's adequacy of evidence, one also tends to move beyond the testing of the surrounding system of different objects present at that moment of its experience toward anticipated pleasure or projections. But, instead of always sticking to testing such projections against experience for viability and adequacy, one tends to allow them a certain degree of autonomy. Here, incidentally, Lacan tacitly poses a challenge to Freud's respect for any postulation that resulted in an increase in generality, and to his heuristic principle, a gain in meaning is a perfectly justifiable ground for going beyond the limits of direct experience. 11 In this process of projection, coherence and delusion often become fused. Persistent and consistent reality testing would oblige one to admit that all coherent systems, ideologies, institutions, etc., are further away from what is real than their proponents desire them to be, for honest reality testing would demonstrate that the real is split, ambivalent, and paradoxical. Coherence is in fact fabricated as a defense, because we desire and require it, and our desire for coherence colors perception. As Lacan puts it, something sieves, in such a way that reality is only perceived by man, in his natural spontaneous state at least, as radically selected. Man 215 deals with selected bits of reality. 12 Tacitly invoking Kant's warning concerning the ideas of reason, Lacan argues, one might say that the backcloth of experience consists in the construction of a certain system of Wunsch, desire, or of Erwartung, expectation, of pleasure, defined as anticipated pleasure, and which tends for this reason to realize itself autonomously in its own sphere, theoretically without expecting anything from the outside. It moves directly toward a fulfillment highly antithetical to whatever triggers it. 13 In other words, if thinking is triggered by the inexplicable, in the form of a singular event, the pleasure principle, rather than reality testing, ensures that its fulfillment is the production of an ideal system in which everything is explained, integrated, unified, stabilized, and systematized. In this case, one domesticates the singular, the flux, the complex, the paradoxical, expelling ideas that are incompatible with a comfortably synthesized worldview, so that it is no longer traumatic. That is, the event as understood is never what it really is, but is something antithetical to this, namely merely a circumscribed part of a system of facilitations, a stable, habitual acquisition that is imaginary rather than real. Knowledge, therefore, is directed first toward achieving my pleasure. Desire gets in the way of truth, which is uncertainty. While humans do seek truth, supposedly, we tend to accept as true only what conforms to our economic pleasure requirements. In conclusion, the automaton, the system of signifying relations, marks off the two extremes, the origin and the telos, of the metaphysics of presence. It envisages the present original as the cause of repetition, or the anticipated structured whole of an ultimately closed system that guarantees repetition of the same in anticipation. Notably, Lacan does not here suggest that we can escape this tendency to produce systems. Nevertheless, it is important to be aware that these are held together in a prosthetic imaginary order, according to which we assume that there must have been a beginning on the basis of the experience present, or that there be a whole on the basis of the partial objects we experience. In the absence of such awareness, the prosthesis tends to become a restricting armor. The touch according to Lacan. As Freud discovers that the function of fantasy is to construct an acceptable reality, he becomes preoccupied with the question, what is the first encounter, the real, that lies behind the fantasy. 14. But since Freud has already construed this originary encounter as a traumatic event, Lacan argues that his analytic drive to uncover an actual, historical occurrence as cause of the repetition compulsion is the quest to 216, the point of anguish, for the impossible. Here, then, Freud offers yet another incompatible articulation of the real, this time in terms of the touch, the encounter with the real, which always lies behind the automaton as a traumatic event and cause of the repetition compulsion which, as Lacan will argue, repeats precisely because the repetition named by reality testing is not possible. In the analytic situation, a repetition compulsion is suspected when repeated hitches or obstacles to analysis seem to occur in an analyzand's narrative as if by chance, that is, as if it is a matter of surprising coincidence rather than implicit engineering. Yet, as Lacan notes, analysts rightly remain suspicious of the apparent contingency of such events in the analyzand's narrative and tend to view them as unconsciously caused. The touch certainly designates this unconscious causality by which, in response to a traumatic event, subjects repeatedly re-engineer order in their lives. But in the cases of disordered order dealt with in psychoanalytic treatment, the re-engineering is overtly paranoiac in character. Every new occurrence is bent into the shape of the disordered order, and the subject unconsciously obstructs or resists analysis in order to keep an invented structure in rigid paralysis, for the alternative, it seems, is to fall to pieces. As John Forrester describes it, the salient feature of the paranoiac universe is that it has no place for a future, no room for maneuver, leaving only the option for apocalypse as marking the difference between now and what is to come. 15. If psychoanalysis aims to undo the Laplacian determinations the patient constructs for him or herself. 16. Lacan argues that the efficacy of conventional or institutional Freudian psychoanalysis is blocked by a misconception of the touch that assimilates it to the automaton. 4. Following Freud's desire to uncover the impossible real, but ignoring this very ambiguity, analysts have mistakenly identified the repetition compulsion with the transference. In other words, Lacan argues, the repetition compulsion is accurately seen to be the real cause of what occurs in the transference, but what is repeated compulsively is taken by such analysts to be simply a reproduction in the space of the analytic relation of the original historical traumatic encounter with the real. Here, then, the relation to the real in the transference is expressed in terms of the automaton. Such analysts presuppose that since one cannot apprehend what was never there in the first place, there must have been something present to apprehend, an original event, a first encounter, the positively present real thing that lies behind the fantasy. It is, supposedly, this determinable event in narrative history that the analysand repeats or acts out, in disguise, in the transference. In this case, the analyst presupposes that it is in 217 principle possible, working by analogy or substitution, to uncover the original trauma as the key to the analysand's disorder and lead the analysand to reproduce the trauma in memory as precisely what it is. In so conceptualizing the real that causes the repetition compulsion, Lacan argues, the true nature of repetition is veiled. As he notes, this construal of the repetition compulsion as merely the return of the signs, or reproduction, or the modulation by the act of a sort of acted out remembering in the transference simply covers over the enigmas of repetition and of trauma. 17. In hoping to uncover the original traumatic encounter with the real, Freud and some of his followers desired too much, for on Freud's own account, this encounter with the real that is the cause of the repetition compulsion is essentially a missed encounter according to Lacan, the trauma determining all that follows, and imposing on it an apparently accidental origin is in principle impossible to assimilate into the analytic experience. Lacan grants that if repetition supports or guarantees something's status as real, then the repetition compulsion suggests that something traumatic really happened. The required reality, which absolves psychoanalysis of the charge of subjective idealism, corresponds to encounters, events, which are radical points in the real that cannot be effaced, forgotten, or assimilated. 18. Derrida confirms this insight. To mark a date in history presupposes that something comes or happens for the first and last time, that is, something singular, something that we do not yet really know how to identify, determine, recognize or analyze, but that should remain from here on unforgettable, an ineffaceable event. 19. The paradox of these ineffaceable radical points in the real is that, precisely because they are traumatic events, they both must and cannot be assimilated. There is a necessity and an impossibility of appropriation in a trauma that, Derrida insists, at once opens itself up to and resists experience. 20. Similarly, as Lacan puts it, the trauma is conceived as having necessarily been marked by the subjectifying homeostasis that orientates the whole functioning defined by the pleasure principle. I take marked by here to mean that the trauma can only be recognized as such, and must be dealt with, in the realm of the automaton, the economic negotiation between pleasure principle and reality principle. Yet the traumatic real, which causes the repetition compulsion, cannot by definition ever have been a fully present event, explainable in terms of the mechanical causality of the automaton. Thus, Lacan notes, psychoanalytic experience raises a problem, for the trauma persists, and at the center of the primary processes, reappears, in effect, frequently unveiled. 21. A dream, for example, the bearer of the subject's desire may produce that which 218 makes the trauma emerge repeatedly, if not its very face, at least the screen that shows us that it is still there behind. In other words, when such an event is made to comply with the demands of the subjectifying homeostasis, an unassimilated and unresolved excess necessarily remains, keeping the event permanently in suspense, in abeyance or delayed, awaiting attention. In French, this is translated as souffrance, which also means the pain of heightened tension. 22. Again, one finds confirmation in Derrida's words. The experience of an event, the mode according to which it affects us, calls for a movement of appropriation, comprehension, recognition, identification, description, determination, interpretation on the basis of a horizon of anticipation, knowledge, naming, and so on. Although this movement of appropriation is irreducible and ineluctable, there is no event worthy of its name except insofar as this appropriation falters at some border or frontier. A frontier, however, with neither front nor confrontation, one that in comprehension does not run into head-on since it does not take the form of a solid front, it escapes, remains evasive, open, undecided, indeterminable. Whence the unappropriability, the unforeseeability, absolute surprise, incomprehension, the risk of misunderstanding, unanticipatable novelty, pure singularity, the absence of horizon. 23. In short, the psyche covers over this abyssal remainder with a screen of economizing, fabricating representatives, objets petits, for Lacan. These objects take shape as the consequence of repressions, disguises, dissociations, fragmentations, deflections, intellectualizations, reductions, displacements, and discussions, which work both to cover over, and point to, the fact that the traumatic event cannot be assimilated. Moreover, it is precisely because the trauma is preserved as impossible to assimilate that we find ourselves repeatedly attempting such assimilation. In Derrida's words, something took place, we have the feeling of not having seen it coming, and certain consequences undeniably follow upon the thing, but this very thing, the place and meaning of this event remains ineffable out of range for a language that admits its powerlessness and so is reduced to pronouncing mechanically a date, repeating it endlessly, as a kind of ritual incantation, a conjuring poem, a journalistic litany or rhetorical refrain that admits to not knowing what it's talking about. We do not in fact know what we are saying or naming in this way. The 11th of September, le 11 September, 219. The 11th of September we repeat this. We must repeat it, and it is all the more necessary to repeat it insofar as we do not really know what is being named in this way, as if to exorcise 2 times at one go, on the one hand, to conjure away, as if by magic, the thing itself, the fear or the terror it inspires, for repetition always protects by neutralizing, deadening, distancing a traumatism. And, on the other hand, to deny as close as possible to this act of language and this enunciation, our powerlessness to name in an appropriate fashion, to characterize, to think the thing in question, to get beyond the mere deictic of the date. 24 Paradoxically, the event as trauma causes the repetition compulsion that screens precisely the impossibility of its repetition. In other words, the repetition is compulsive because there can never be a proper repetition of the event, which, having happened, without being there, can never be refound. One cannot get over, past, beyond the trauma precisely because it cannot be repeated. We repeat not in order to master the trauma but precisely because we cannot in principle achieve such mastery. But notably, for Derrida as for Lacan, we repeat as much for protection as for the sarcasm of inventive sublimation. Lacan concludes, the reality system, however far it is developed, leaves an essential part of what belongs to the real a prisoner in the toils of the pleasure principle. 25 In other words, zwang, compulsion, that is, the death drive and its impossible aim of jouissance, governs the very diversions of the primary process. Recall that the primary process operates in the gap between perception, for example, of sounds, and consciousness, a sound that has meaning for me, by which perceptual events are converted into an interpreted, meaningful, articulated phenomenal reality. 26 For Lacan, one may apprehend this state of primary processing, directed by the death drive, by way of an example, namely, the experience of dreaming under the effect of perceptual events just before one awakens. He describes a situation in which an impatient knocking became manifest in his own dream as something other than a knocking at the door. On awakening, he notes, it is only by detaching from his dream representation, the scenario presented to consciousness through the dream, and reconstituting the event of the knocking as a perceptual representation that he becomes aware of it as a knocking at the door that bears with it knowledge that I am there, at what time I went to sleep, and why I went to sleep. 27 In other words, the dream representation associated with the knocking is not at all the same as the perceptual representation of the same event. 220 Turning to the questions of what really wakes us up from such a dream and what we really awaken to, it seems obvious that it was the knocking in the real world that caused the dreamer to wake up. One could say that one wakes up from a dream, a hallucination, to reality. But, of course, things are more complex than this. There is, for Lacan, far more at issue in the notion of the real. As he hints, perhaps we shall see better what is at issue, by apprehending what is there that motivates the emergence of the represented reality here defined as the phenomenon, distance, the gap itself that constitutes awakening. 28 Lacan, notably, has subtly reversed the above formulation. It is also possible to say that one awakens from the real manifest in the dream to the fantasy, a hallucination, of a coherently articulated phenomenal reality. In this case, Lacan argues that the true cause of my awakening is not the perceptual event incorporated into the dream, the knocking, but a different kind of encounter, namely an essentially missed encounter with the real, which is tied to the knocking associatively. To explain this claim further, Lacan discusses a famous example from Freud's Traumdeutung, the unfortunate father who went to rest in the room next to the one in which his dead child lay, leaving the child in the care, we are told, of another old man. The old man, unable to maintain his vigil, knocks off, a candle falls, and the bedclothes around the body of the dead child catch alight. At the same time, the father dreams that the child is near his bed, takes him by the arm and whispers to him reproachfully, "Father, can't you see that I am burning?" The father is then awoken by something. 29 Problematizing two of Freud's hypotheses, namely, that dreams are wish fulfillments and that they function to prolong sleep. He argues that indications in Freud's texts allow us to produce the question, what is it that wakes the sleeper? Is it not, in the dream, another reality? For, as he argues, the father does not persuade himself in the dream that his child is still alive. Rather, the terrible vision of the dead son taking the father by the arm designates a beyond that makes itself heard in the dream. One wonders, Lacan remarks, if there is more of the real in the vision than in the perceptual reality of what is happening in the room next door. 30 In other words, in a dream one connects perceptions together in a way that refers to and threatens to expose, unveil, another reality, the real that is associated with a traumatic event. As concerns the dreaming father, perhaps this real is represented by the traumatic desire for immortality and consequent self-recrimination that are tied to the fear of unnatural causes, a sense of the uncanny, of the devil, in the event of a child predeceasing the parent, and the sense that the child would have survived had 221 he been a proper father, an immortal believer, a match for the fever. Whatever it is, Lacan argues, he awakens in order to avoid having to confront the traumatic real, attached like a cotton thread to the accusation in the sentence, "Father, can't you see I'm burning?" To escape the abyssal encounter with the real, the father awakens to another reality. Thus, Lacan asks, is not the dream essentially, one might say, an act of homage to the missed reality, the reality that can no longer produce itself except by repeating itself endlessly, in some never-attained awakening? 31 In a remark echoed in the earlier citation from Derrida's Automunity, pronouncing mechanically a date, repeating it endlessly, as a kind of ritual incantation, a conjuring poem, a journalistic litany or rhetorical refrain that admits to not knowing what it's talking about. Lacan adds that it is only in the dream that this truly unique encounter can occur. Only a right, an endlessly repeated act, can commemorate this not very memorable encounter, for no one can say what the death of a child is. 32 The awakening that resituates us in a constituted phenomenal reality, Lacan argues, offers evidence that we are not dreaming. The awakening shows us the waking state of the subject's consciousness in the representation of what has happened, the unfortunate accident in reality, against which one can do no more than take steps. In other words, the waking state of the subject's consciousness puts together or represents what actually happened according to the causality of the automaton, which one could just as well name internal time consciousness. But how does one understand what is put together or represented in the dream, in the terrible vision of the dead son taking the father by the arm and in the voice that is heard to ask, "Father, can't you see I'm burning?" As Lacan remarks, this sentence is itself a firebrand, of itself it brings fire where it falls, and one cannot see what is burning, for the flames blind us to the fact that the fire bears on the real. 33 Again, note the echo where Derrida speaks of Freud's legacy in terms of an archive fever as already cited. In chapter 5, Derrida wonders what may have burned secretly, without remains and without knowledge. With no possible response, be it spectral or not, short of or beyond a suppression, on the other edge of repression, originary or secondary, without a name, without the least symptom, and without even an ush. 34 In more prosaic terms, the dream imagery, as a counterpart of conscious representation according to the causality of the automaton, puts together what happened, as event trauma not naval or the real, according to the causality of the tush, as the cause of the repetition compulsion. What the unconscious puts together as a veil that covers /222 uncovers an unspeakable, inconceivable happening, a missed encounter, is essentially determined by the Vorstellungsrepresentans, Object A. Object A, the representative of a representation, can be understood as that which gives shape to that toward which the death drive drives, namely, a hoped for immortality, which is itself already an aporetic, retrospectively constituted representation of the all's totality, infinity, or paradoxically open-ended. 35 Object A, then, marks no worldly object but the loss of itself that the subject first experiences upon facing the dread of its necessary constitution as a lacking being whose Paradoxical, possible/impossible task is to refine itself, its immortality. Immortality, then, as that toward which the drive drives, directs the unconscious synthesis by which individuals project into consciousness a representative, object A, invested with the supposed power to restore their immortality, and to which they return compulsively in an inventive repetition that can only ever be an iteration. The generalized statement of insatiable desire, in other words, is that I should have been immortal. Lacan concludes his analysis of the dream with the remark that awakening works in two directions. If awakening resituates us in a constituted phenomenal reality and offers evidence that we are not dreaming, it also carries out the task of separating us from and covering over the traumatic real. In this case, it offers evidence that we are fantasizing. In this discussion, then, he points to the ambiguous status of phenomenal reality as escape, as delusional fantasy of coherence and interpretability. 36 Moreover, he adds, one would have to search for the real beyond the dream imagery, in what the dream had enveloped, hidden from us, behind the lack of representation of which there is only one representative. In other words, behind the dream imagery, which is non-representational in the sense that it does not represent actual reality but stands as the projection of a desire for immortality, there lies the object A, representative of the drive and cause of desire. This desire for an impossible immortality, impossible in the sense of ineradicably aporetic, he claims, is the real that governs our activities more than any other, and it is psychoanalysis that designates it for us. According to Lacan, then, one may find in the touch, the kind of causality bound up with the real, which suggests that the true motivation for our actions has to do with an unconscious desire for immortality. Freud's solution to the problem that Kierkegaard centers on repetition. 37 Freud's solution is an explanation of why self-constitution is, in its psychoanalytically preferred sense, a matter of Kierkegaard's new category of 223 repetition, the kind that paradoxically refines the immortal self by reproducing it forward, so to speak. The idea that self-constitution is always a matter of repetition, of refinding the self, goes down to Freud's understanding of the origin of the self as essentially split from itself, its own immortality, due to the paradoxical choral space forward/gap constituted by the lamella. Notably, for Lacan, to adumbrate what is to come in later chapters, the kind of healthy analyze and that psychoanalysis ultimately aims to engender is a subject who is capable of genuinely ethical action, which is inscribed in the paradox of repetition imposed by the phrase become who you are. 38 Unlike a paranoid or hysterical subject, whose desired immortality is represented as the delusion of totality or infinity respectively, such a subject dreams of immortality in the form of a paradoxical open-endedness. But if this is the case, it is less that Kierkegaard poses a problem for which Freud offers a solution than of providing through psychoanalytic theory an enriching translation of Kierkegaard's solution. Lacan's remarks here not only presuppose familiarity with Kierkegaard's repetition, to which they respond, but they are also too condensed for the progression of an argument to be much more than conjecture. 39 Nevertheless, one may advisedly take the hint and turn to Kierkegaard's essay in experimental psychology for help. Naming him the most acute of the questioners of the soul before Freud, Lacan initiates his discussion by expressing admiration for the way in which Kierkegaard's essay abolishes the mirages of love by showing that I am the true object of my desire, or, in other words, that desire is essentially narcissistic. 40 Notably, in Lacanian discourse, primordial narcissism names the desire for immortality. 41 What Lacan has in mind here is the first point of crisis in a complex love affair. Narrated by Constantine, one of Kierkegaard's many pseudonyms. Constantine tells of a young man who, having already provoked his interest due to both the promise of a profound nature which possessed more than one register and the seductive immaturity and pliability of youth, commands his serious attention when he announces that he has fallen in love. 42 As Constantine recounts, he told me that he had already been in love for some time but had concealed it from me. Now he had attained the goal of his desire, had declared his love and found it reciprocated again. The young man of whom I speak was deeply and sincerely and beautifully and humbly in love. For a long while I have not been so delighted by anything as by looking at him. For it is often a dreary thing to be an observer. 43 224 Yet, as Constantine astutely observes, the fact that the event of falling in love is traumatic for the young man is already manifest in his mood of unappeasable melancholic longing when apart from the beloved, as if she were already lost and he stood at the end of the relationship instead of at the beginning. 44 This mood, for him, prefigures an awakening to the truth that, he intimates, is inevitable for a thinking person, namely, that on attaining the goal of his desire he will find it to be spurious, for the loved worldly object merely represents a desire directed towards something more profoundly lost at birth, one's own immortal self. A profound loss of self, Constantine reflects, is inevitable from the moment of birth. Yet, he insists, there must be a living spirit in me that refuses this death and opens out to the future, to the chance of repetition by which I regain myself. In his words, it must be true that one's life is over at the first instant, but there must be vitality enough to kill this death and transform it into life. 45 Constantine, however, mistakenly believes that the chance for repetition is intentionally made through strength of will, perseverance, and rational action. In his estimation, the young man's soul is too soft for this hardship. Ultimately Kierkegaard argues that one is given the chance for such repetition, when all is lost, by virtue of the absurd, as a gift from God. The predicted awakening soon occurs and the young man admits to Constantine that the young girl was not his love, she was the occasion of awakening the primitive poetic talent within him and making him a poet. 46 He recognizes that he no longer had need of the rung of the ladder on which he had climbed and that in reality her existence or non-existence was in a certain sense of no importance to him. 47 Paradoxically, the love that is directed toward her has revealed and blocked, awakened and diverted, his true narcissistic desire to regain himself. As his muse she is a visible semblance of his immortal poetic soul. As his beloved she threatens to divert his desire and imprison it in the mundane mortality of marriage, procreation, and domestic routine. In the terms of the prevailing courtship conventions, Kierkegaard's poet has no honorable option but to marry the woman to whom he had declared his undying love. However, this leaves him in a double bind, for he can no more admit this to the girl than continue with the relationship. To construct a real relationship out of this misunderstanding was impossible for him. It would have meant to make her the victim of an eternal deception. To explain to her the mistake by letting her know that she was only the visible semblance, whereas his 225 thought, his soul, was seeking something else which he transferred figuratively to her, would mortify her so deeply that his pride revolted against it. 48 Unwilling to be guilty of her unhappiness, then, he strives to keep up the pretense of loving her. But he knows that in committing his love to the worldly object, to the mere semblance, he destroys his chance to become what he is. Thus, simultaneously, he cursed existence, his love and the darling girl who was the obstacle that both revealed and barred his chance for repetition. 49 One conclusion to be drawn from Kierkegaard's account is that love for any worldly object is always a deflection of desire. For Lacan, this would not necessarily amount to the criticism that worldly love imprisons the soul in inadequacy, as it might appear to be from Kierkegaard's account. On the contrary, as I shall show in chapter 11, which deals with ethical action, he insists upon the importance of this structure of deflection for the revised notion of sublimation. Love sublimates the object, that plays a crucial part in ethical action. Yet, to return to the task of decoding, he observes that Kierkegaard's account does demonstrate how one may become a prisoner of love. Love's exaltation of the other spuriously makes of it the source of all possible satisfactions. In so doing, unlike the poet, who was aware of his double bind, one unwittingly demands from the other a fullness of satisfaction that it cannot give, namely, what Lacan calls narcissistic satisfaction. By loving her, I place a demand on her to complete me, or, that is, extinguish my desire. It is a false demand because in truth the other is not my missing complement, I am. The loved other is merely the facade that reveals and conceals this. For Kierkegaard, the repetition through which the true self is refound occurs when one is given the chance to rise above the deflecting desire for worldly others and to assume the true object of desire, namely, the self. In other words, repetition occurs when you are given the chance to become who you are or, in Lacan's terms, to assume your desire clearly. When speaking of such repetition, both Kierkegaard and Freud are dealing with a form of repetition that is beyond the refound object of everyday pragmatics. In Lacan's words, Freud is not dealing with any repetition residing in the natural, no return of need, any more than is Kierkegaard. The return of need is directed towards consumption placed at the service of appetite. Repetition demands the new 50. This is an allusion to Kierkegaard's articulation of the dialectic of repetition notably. Kierkegaard distinguishes his conception of repetition from a traditionally philosophical, recollective nostalgia that bows out of 226 time from the beginning. As Caputo puts it, for the Greeks eternity always already has been, it is a presence which we always already possess but with which we have lost contact. Eternity is a lost actuality. Thus the point of philosophical speculation is to ease oneself out of time, as one would back out of a dead end, to steal back into eternity. 51 In contrast, Kierkegaard insists, repetition leaps forward within time from what has been, each repetition is a renewal of what has been, without which, what has been will not have been. In his words, the dialectic of repetition is easy, for what is repeated has been, otherwise it could not be repeated, but precisely the fact that it has been gives to repetition the character of novelty. 52 But, as Lacan goes on to note, one must be careful not to misunderstand such novelty in terms of the power of variation. The demand for something new in one's activities, that is, novelty as variation, is not the same as the novelty intrinsic to repetition. In fact, concerning repetition, we are rather talking about the paradoxical novelty implied in the demand for the same again, for the very necessity of this demand shows up the true secret of repetition, namely, the most radical diversity constituted by repetition in itself. 53 Referring to Freud's observation that children cannot have their pleasurable experiences repeated often enough, and they are inexorable in their insistence that the repetition shall be an identical one. 54 Lacan notes that children here are implicitly aware of the diversity intrinsic to repetition that threatens it. It can be seen in the child, in his first movement, at the moment when he is formed as a human being, manifesting himself as an insistence that the story should always be the same, that its recounted realization should be ritualized, that is to say, textually the same. This requirement of a distinct consistency in the details of its telling signifies that the realization of the signifier will never be able to be careful enough in its memorization to succeed in designating the primacy of the significance as such. 55 This citation contains a tacit reference to what is revealed through Constantine's actions and reflections, namely that the requirement for constancy in the telling, in the symbolic order, tacitly acknowledges the impossibility of repetition in the real yet insists upon its possibility as engineered from above in the ostensibly transcendent symbolic order. To resolve the internal conflicts of the tormented young poet, Constantine hatches a game plan, which promises to manipulate events according to a precisely engineered strategy, such that the poet, by acting the part of a faithless philanderer, escapes his love relationship in a way that preserves 227 his poetic nature and the lady's honor. 56 This release, as Constantine notes, would carry the small cost to the poet of his own public reputation, but where it really counts, in his own eyes, he will have acted honorably. The young man, however, loses the nerve for this eminently rational scheme, balks at submitting to an unjust public charge of guilt, and simply absconds. In Constantine's estimation, his soul lacked the elasticity of irony. He has not the strength to take irony's vow of silence, nor the power to keep it. Only he who really is able to love is a man, and only he who is able to give his love whatsoever expression it may be is an artist. 57 But it is in contrast to Constantine's paranoiac artistry that the young poet is to discover the new category of repetition. The poet's lack of nerve for engineering events such that he could be free for repetition unsettles Constantine enough that he undertakes a parodic, experimental journey to see if repetition is indeed possible. He finds only the inexorability of flux, and he even returns home unexpectedly to face the terrorizing chaos of an authorized spring cleaning. He is set to wondering whether one should rather be swept along in the stream of life as unconcerned by its events as a child in a pram. But he has not the nerve for such faith in the world, and his ultimate solution to its flux is a deathly imposition of constancy. In psychoanalytic terms, a repetition compulsion, a monotonous and uniform order was restored in my whole household economy. For though I had convinced myself that no such thing as repetition exists, yet it is a sure truth that by firmness of purpose and by dulling one's talent for observation one can attain a uniformity which has a far more anesthetizing effect than the most capricious diversions, and which with time becomes stronger and stronger, like a formula of incantation. 58 For Constantine, then, freedom for repetition is understood as achieved by the autonomous power of conscious will, reflection, thought, and signifying practices. It is articulated in terms of the power to extricate the self from the worldly flux of conflicts and paradoxes, maintain an ironic, reflective distance from pathological being, and control its manifestations by imposing on it a self-made order. To avoid the problem of stasis, one may institute, via the rotation method, the rational synthesis of repetition and variation, a controlled variation, a regulated movement. What Kierkegaard calls repetition as shrewdness treats worldly objects, people, passions, objects, situations, as game pieces to be manipulated in order to serve one's will, to fit into an order of one's own making. Yet, 228 Constantine reflects, is it not true that the older one gets, the more deceptive life proves to be, that the shrewder one becomes and the more ways one learns to help oneself, the worse scrapes one gets into. 59 Repetition as shrewdness founders on self-contradiction. By dulling one's talent for observation one leaves phenomenal reality behind and achieves only the freedom of fantasy, which is no freedom at all. In psychoanalytic terms, the strongest repetition compulsion is no guarantee against the return of the repressed. To sum up so far, in relation to self-constitution, repetition refers to the task of forging an identity anew each time. But it is not a matter of producing this or that identity for myself and varying it when it suits the situation. As Lacan puts it, to develop it, novelty, by varying the significations is therefore, it would seem, to elude it, novelty in the sense of repeating forward. 60 Rather it is a matter of forging an identity that can persevere in time through constant renewal as the same. In Kierkegaard's words, in the individual, then, repetition appears as a task for freedom, in which the question becomes that of saving one's personality from being volatilized and, so to speak, a pawn to events. 61 Yet if the self is to be saved from being volatilized by events, it does not suffice, as Kierkegaard argues through the figure of Constantine, to think of the self as in control of events. In other words, what one may glimpse again here is the function of the touch, as a condition of possibility / impossibility, a causality, of a different order that underpins the paradoxical injunction to become who you are. Kierkegaard's new category of repetition becomes apparent in the contrast between Constantine and the young poet. As Kierkegaard insists, it is left to the young poet to move beyond Constantine, the quintessential contemplative reflector and aesthete, and in so doing discover the new category of repetition. Kierkegaard will make Constantine step aside for the young man, who with his religious primitiveness is to discover repetition. 62 So what we see finally in repetition is the transformation of the young man. After he disappears, through letters to Constantine, with no return address, we find out that for him everything is lost, his love, his muse, the poetry, and he remains paralyzed and in torment. He has lost everything that he already is, or has been, or has already counted as his identity. The implication is that freedom to repeat yourself, the ability to become who you are, does not depend on what the other is to you or on what the other does intentionally. Nor does it depend on your own intentional acts. It will depend, as we shall see, on a gift. All that was left to the poet was the persevering insistence that he was not guilty. What really attracted him 229 to Job, however, was the fact that he was in the right. On this point now everything turns. Fate has played him a trick in letting him become guilty. If this is the way it stands, he can never more recapture himself. 63 Then he reads a notice in the paper of her marriage to another man. This is the unexpected thunderstorm that releases him for poetry and returns him to himself. The chance for freedom, paradoxically, is found to be not a matter of the imposition of will but a gift from God. Freedom to become who you are is, paradoxically, given to you as a gift, as a thunderstorm that you cannot predict and cannot make happen. Then I receive myself again, and precisely in such a way that I must feel doubly the significance of it. In this case he transfigures repetition as his own consciousness raised to the second power. 64 Now freedom breaks forth in its highest form, in which it is defined in relation to itself. In his revision of Freud's interpretation of his grandson's famous game of thought, the Lacan argues that it illustrates the origin of the structure of self-loss that underlies the repetition involved in the phrase become who you are or assume your desire, as mentioned earlier. Although Freud raises the question of whether the repetition of painful experiences challenges the primacy of the pleasure principle, he ultimately comes to the conclusion that one can read the game as conforming to the demands of the pleasure principle. For Freud, the cotton reel, among other possibilities, could be said to represent the absent mother. In this case, the child replays in a game the traumatic moment of her departure, gaining mastery over it by making her absence intentional. I have thrown you away. But this interpretation remains entirely in the domain of the return of need, the satisfaction of the need for mastery over objects and events. Lacan thinks there is more to it than this. The child does not cry, nor does he look at the door. In relation to the grandson's game, Lacan argues, against Freud, that the game does indeed represent something that exceeds the pleasure principle. The game replays a traumatic event, a splitting in the subject and the inauguration of a death drive or repetition compulsion. The child repeats not in order to master the event but precisely because mastery is impossible. The cotton reel for him represents not the mother but the object cause of desire, which is the part of the subject that splits off from it forever upon the loss of the mother. It represents, in other words, the imaginary missing complement that is attached to the subject by the thread of desire, the desire for restitution, the desire to bring it back, to put ourselves back together. But each time the child retrieves the cotton reel, it becomes again only a cotton reel and not 230 the sought-after restitution that would complete the self, so the game is repeated endlessly. 65 Ultimately, Lacan, like Kierkegaard, argues for the tush as the real cause of the true self. These remain in scare quotes because the real cause of the self, the tush, turns out to be no thing, not nothing, but an inarticulable, traumatic event, the gift of God, in Kierkegaard's idiom, and the true self turns out to be the lacking being or split subject, whose ethical task is, as Kierkegaard suggests, to become who she is in the recognition and assumption of her desire. If Lacanian psychoanalysis adds a caveat, it will be that such a task, as his version of the Ford game indicates, is finally impossible, which, as Derrida would add, is no reason for abdicating. To sum up, the contrast between automaton and tush, as the contrast between two types of causality, is also viewed by Lacan in terms of the difference between law and cause. 66 The cause, unlike the law, is never present in the field of consciousness that it affects. But that does not mean that it is absent /nothing. Just as justice is never present in the field of law, for example, trauma is never present in the field of repetition. Phenomenal reality, constituted in and by what is law governed in our use of language, belongs to the economic domain of the possible. Here, the death of a child is only real insofar as I can account for it phenomenally. He had a fever, he died at 4 o'clock, and so on. The real by contrast appears as failures, ruptures, and inconsistencies caused by the tush. Here, the death of a child is only real insofar as it cannot be represented, for as soon as I economize it in phenomenal terms, it loses its status as real to fictional constructions. This, however, is not to say that the death of a child is absolutely unrepresentable. It is represented negatively as that which lies behind and hollows out all the attempts at representation. 67 In other words, while impossible and only negatively inscribed in the automaton as that which goes wrong, this real is not nothing. In the aftermath of the fall of subjective idealism, then, one cannot resort to naive realism but must instead insist that there is not nothing. 68 Although a discussion of Lacan's account of the impossible real in tush and automaton is already enough to demonstrate an accord between Lacan's notion of the real and Derrida's thinking of difference, I shall graft onto this account another way of addressing the real, through Koplik's account of Lacan's remarks concerning the lesson to be learned from set theory. Addressing what she calls the problem of the all, this graft serves to demonstrate how Lacan addresses the uneconomic and economic aprias of nominalism and universalism and the veil of alienation according to which they are articulated. 231 The real and inventive sublimation, the lesson of set theory. Turning to the question of what is real, another consideration arises, hinted at in the last paragraph of tush and automaton, namely the problem of universals and particulars. In relation to this issue, according to Koplik, Lacan argues that there is something important to be learned from what set theory had to absorb when faced with Bertrand Russell's notorious demonstration of our inability to move automatically from a particular concept to the existence of a numberable set, and all were whole. 69 Perhaps unaware of just what he would set in motion, Russell proposed a concept, or predicate or condition, from which it was impossible to form a set. That concept was a set that does not include itself. 70 This is a perfectly ordinary concept that describes a perfectly common kind of set. For example, the set of all cats does not include itself, because it is a set, not a cat. The set of all things that are not cats would include itself. But one cannot form a set from the concept sets that do not include themselves, assuming that set A aims to be the set of all sets that do not include themselves. The difficulty is this: if set A includes itself, it cannot conform to its own definition and must not, therefore, include itself. But if set A does not include itself, then it must include itself. This perfectly ordinary condition, then, is paradoxical, and the set that it conditions consequently becomes self-undermining, or auto-deconstructing. Concerning what to make of this difficulty associated with the formation of sets, or wholes or universals, which is in fact the problem of how to understand the real, there are certain, hopefully by now quite familiar, uneconomic, economic, and aporetic options. Notably, the following discussion represents a way of recasting the aporetic articulation of nominalism and essentialism addressed in Chapter 1. Nominalism and the uneconomic aporia on the one hand, Koplik argues, Russell's demonstration could be taken in support of the nominalist claim that only particulars exist and that thought gets tangled up in paradoxes because it tries to introduce universals, categories, sets, or classes, that have no real existence. That is, it might be taken to demonstrate the impotence of abstract thinking, which continually builds and unbuilds, while mistaking them for givens, series of arbitrary and alterable universals. 71 In different terms, one might use the paradoxes of set theory as support for the proposition that thought is never adequate to being because being consists only of predicates, and 232 What thought thinks, namely an underlying more general thing behind the predicates that would support them, and bind them together, does not exist. 72 Thus, for example, there is no humankind as such but only particular, unique, singular humans. Likewise, there is no bare life whose absolute sanctity remains incontrovertible but only particular individual lives. Any such universals or wholes, then, can be seen as subjectively constituted and vulnerable to collapse when it is seen that absolutely nothing underpins them. Implicitly, here, if it were possible to strip away, or erase, all determinations of being, all predicates or particular concepts, nothing at all would be left. The idea of such erasure, in Kopy's words, is intended precisely to foreground historical contingency, to demonstrate that the accretion of particular features by this or that subject, that the cumulate deposits of ego identifications, are the result of historical circumstances that could have been otherwise and that these particular features are therefore inessential. They could easily be stripped away, effaced, by subsequent or alternative circumstances. 73 In this case, however, thought seems impotent. It cannot think the all of being because the all of being is an infinite number of particulars, atoms, that cannot be gathered together in a unity. Here, thought faces the impasse of an aporia. The condition that makes an all possible, namely that nothing be excluded from it, is precisely the condition that simultaneously makes it impossible, for the imperative not to exclude anything makes it impossible to think everything since, as Kopy puts it, no all can form where inclusion knows no limit. 74 Universalism and the economic aporia. On the other hand, Kopy argues, Russell's demonstration of the paradox in set theory might be taken in support of the essentialist claim that only universal structures exist and that thought gets tangled up in paradoxes because it tries to accord existence to particular, contingent, nominal unities, empirical concepts, that have no real existence. In other words, Russell's demonstration might be taken as a reminder of thought's impotence, exemplified in the assertion that being as such transcends every particular attempt to impose an appropriation on it. 75 This economic stance, in contrast to an economic nominalism, confirms the existence or ultimate presence of being as such or the thing itself, for example humankind as such, while granting that no predicate will be sufficiently large to grasp it properly. 233 On this account, the idea of erasure is understood differently. As Kopy puts it, from politics to aesthetics, the negative gesture that helped define modernism, erasure, was able to wipe the slate clean, all the way down to the material support itself, pure, pristine, and generalizable, humanity itself, being as such, a neutral, Cartesian grid. 76 In this case, as she notes, erasure does not erase all, leaving nothing at all, but would make one exception. In her words, despite its self-presentation, erasure encounters its limit when it reaches the empty page or blank slate, not evidence that the process has been finally accomplished. As long as this empty support, an uninflected, neutral humanity, being as one, as uniform, remains behind, we can be sure that something has survived untouched by the processes of historical contingency. The notion of a universal humanity stands outside and domesticates history, making the latter the agent of merely minor variations on its already decided script. 77 Again, thought is assumed to be impotent. It cannot think the all of being because the all of being, while unitary, transcends any particular concept of it. 78 According to the logic of exclusion, thinking and being are separated in a way that puts being out of reach and makes of it a lost origin or a future ideal to strive for. In this case, the condition that makes an all, a whole, possible, namely the exclusion that constructs an ultimate limit, a telos, center, or ground, is precisely the condition that simultaneously makes it impossible, for any exclusion or limit simultaneously constitutes both an accredited inside and a prohibited outside, which means that in the moment it is constituted as a whole it is also constituted as something that lacks what is outside and is, therefore, not all. Inventive sublimation. In each of the above cases it is assumed that thought is in some way impotent. We cannot think the all of being, in the first case because it amounts to an infinity of atoms that cannot be counted, and in the second, because it represents a totality that transcends any concept. In other words, in both cases thought and being, defined as pure absence or as pure presence, are viewed as external to one another. Notably, these two kinds of inability to say everything, or two kinds of dissatisfaction with the world, are not only both internally aporetic but are paradoxically related, or joined through Lacan's veil of alienation. For the sarcasm of historicity, nominalism denies what universalism desires, namely something there that resists erasure, but this denial is self-undermining, for utter epistle 234 groundlessness is just as inimical to historicity. On the other hand, for the sarcasm of the repetition necessary for a history of effects, universalism insists on precisely what nominalism denies. However, to name a pre-existing totality as a guarantee of repetition is similarly inimical to the very notion of historicity. As always, it cannot be a matter of choosing between these opposing options. Following Lacan, Kopy prefers an alternative approach based on the argument that trauma both resists erasure and is a condition of history. Lacan argues that the hard kernel of the real is, as Kopy puts it, the indivisible and invincible remainder of the process of erasure, but what he has in mind here, as should have become clear through the previous discussion, is the real as trauma. Here, the metaphor of the hard kernel is to be taken in the sense of it being the most resistant resistance, that which cannot be erased or subtracted away, that which always remains as a residue that cannot be circumvented precisely because what remains is paradoxically neither an absence nor a presence but an unassimilable trauma, a swarming void, an entangled knot or a navel. For example, Kopy argues that when Freud, considering his own Jewish identity, tries a process of erasure by which he might have been expected to arrive at the clean slate of a neutral identity, he discovers that something resists his efforts at erasure, something refuses to be wiped away. His Jewishness. 79 The event of being Jewish can be substituted with being woman or being black with Rwanda or 9/11 or with endless other original/originary events. What survives erasure survives not because it is some set of positive features but precisely because it is traumatic. 80 Moreover, as Kopy notes, it is precisely because it cannot be negated that we say it eternally returns or repeats. 81 Thus, to turn in a circle, the most resistant resistance, the hard kernel that puts a stop to analysis is also a seed, as disseminative as difference, as productive of new life. By virtue of a paradox by which the death drive, at its heart, produces the seeds of new life, it is the real as trauma, the event which guarantees that nothing escapes history. 82 Trauma is the condition of history because it sets the movement of iterability in motion. On Lacan's account, Kopy adds, Russell's paradox exposes not confusions in the domain of impotent thought, placed in an external relation to being, but the power of thought in its constitutive relation to being. To think is not to introduce a split between being and a power external to being that reflects upon entities. Rather, thinking and being are mutually implicated, such that to think is to introduce an internal splitting that detotalizes being. By insisting upon such detotalization, Lacan does 235 not deny the existence of universals. Rather, he insists that universals, Jewish, woman, black, Rwanda, sexual difference, are real. These universals, moreover, form an internal limit to thought. They have on the one hand a synthesizing function that universalizes by causing thought to revolve ceaselessly around them and not some other event. Remaining impossible, they persistently draw thought into the attempt to appropriate, grasp, or make sense of them, to discuss, reason, argue, come to agreement, confirm, conform, etc. A responsible appropriation of an event or thing, whether as a scientific, aesthetic, poetic, or any other phenomenon, may indeed grasp what it is, but, on the other hand, the internal limit formed by the real also has a detotalizing function, since it subtracts itself from thought. That is, it can never be assimilated to this or that thought, for the very grasp compounds its being such that it becomes what it is plus what is made of it. Its very appropriation by thought constitutes the particular phenomenon at a particular moment and in a particular context, and, paradoxically, increases it in a detotalizing gesture that has no knowable limits. Thought, in Derridian terms, gives both the present and compounds it by making of the present a gift. One might say that the phenomenon is iterated rather than repeated, and because this movement is limitless, the object of reflection is sublimated. 83 Such detotalization only happens as a parasitic byproduct or residue, when there is thought. The real, then, also ruptures the symbolic such that it is impossible for language to function literally. The failure of the signifier to specify precisely what it wants to say opens the space in the symbolic for grasping that what happens exceeds sense, but not as a beyond posited before language, but as its product. Thought, then, is both separated from the real and tied to it in an endless circulation. The concept becomes a veil that both reveals and conceals, captures and loses, the traumatic origin event, making it both repeatable and unrepeatable. This paradoxical iterability is what makes trauma the guarantee of historicity. 84 These formulations have come so close to the formulations already offered of difference that one could without injustice argue for an accord between the two notions. In the chapter to follow, which addresses sexual difference as a nickname for difference and for the Lacanian real, I hope to press this accord further, in so doing adding further, more detailed support for my contention that one may counter Derrida's prejudicial misreading of Lacanian discourse by demonstrating their interweaving.